When the millionaire's tears touched the barren soil of the abandoned garden, a tiny seed dormant for decades finally sprang to life. In that moment, both the man and the land understood that true wealth had never resided in the vault, but in the calloused hands of the elderly gardener who, for 40 years, had planted hope where everyone else saw only desolation. 6 months before that transformative moment, Helen walked the dusty streets of the industrial district carrying her small gardening tool bag. At 72, her steps were still firm, but her hands trembled slightly as she held the rusty key to the gate guarding what was once the city's most beautiful garden. The land, now owned by Magnus Construction, awaited demolition to make way for yet another luxury apartment complex. Helen had dedicated 40 years of her life to that garden. She started as an assistant to the old groundskeeper when she was only 30, a recent widow, mother of 2 young children. The salary was modest, but the work brought her something money couldn't buy: purpose. Every morning she arrived before dawn to water the plants, prune the bushes, and talk to the flowers as if they were old friends. "Plants listen," she used to say to anyone who would listen. "They feel when you truly love them." For decades, the city garden was the green heart of the town. Families had picnics under the shade of the century-old trees that Helen cared for like daughters. Children ran through the flower beds while parents rested on the wooden benches she had suggested to the former mayor. Couples proposed marriage among the rose bushes that bloomed under her watchful care. But times changed. The new city administration, led by politicians who saw only numbers on spreadsheets, decided to sell the land to pay off debts. The garden was closed to the public. Helen was laid off with a paltry severance package, and the plants were left to their fate. That was 2 years ago. Since then, Helen had returned to the site every day, unofficially, driven by a love that transcended employment contracts. She had obtained a copy of the key from the old groundskeeper, who shared her grief at seeing the garden wither. She arrived early, before the construction company's security guards made their sporadic rounds, and tended to what could still be saved. Each day, the garden grew worse. The rose bushes died first, followed by the delicate petunias she cultivated with such care. The flower beds turned into dry, cracked earth. The trees lost their leaves and began to show signs of disease. It was like watching a dear friend slowly wither away. But Helen didn't give up. She carried water in plastic bottles, improvised watering cans with old containers, and continued to talk to the surviving plants as if they could hear her through time and neglect. "Hold on, my dear," she murmured to a small jacaranda sapling that stubbornly persisted near the old fountain. "We can still have hope." The situation changed drastically when Augustus Magnus decided to personally inspect the land his company had purchased. Augustus was a 58-year-old man, hardened by the business world and convinced that progress demanded sacrifices. Heir to a family of builders, he had transformed a small company into a real estate empire, always guided by the principle that idle land was a waste of economic potential. That Thursday morning, Augustus arrived at the garden, accompanied by 2 engineers and an architect. He wore an impeccable gray suit and Italian leather shoes that contrasted with the uneven ground. He was mentally visualizing the design of the new development, 300 apartments distributed across 3 20-story towers, with a gym, pool, and gourmet area. That's when he saw her. Helen was kneeling near the old fountain, her hands dirty with earth, delicately caressing the leaves of the small jacaranda sapling. She hadn't noticed the arrival of the men, completely absorbed in her labor of love. She hummed an old song as she watered the little plant with water from a plastic bottle. "Who is that woman?" Augustus asked the security guard who quickly approached. "It's the old woman who always shows up here, Mr. Magnus. We've asked her several times to stop trespassing, but she always comes back." Augustus watched Helen for a few minutes. Something about the scene disturbed him in a strange way. The old woman's dedication, the tenderness with which she treated a plant doomed to disappear, the silent stubbornness in the face of the inevitable. It was as if she didn't understand the economic reality of the situation. "Madam," he said, approaching with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, "you can't stay here. This is private property." Helen raised her face, and for the first time Augustus saw her eyes. They were brown, deep, and contained a serenity he couldn't comprehend. There was no anger, no fear, only an ancient sadness that seemed to carry the weight of the world. "I know, sir," she replied softly, "but they need care." Augustus looked around. The garden was clearly dead. Dry earth, leafless bushes, empty flower beds. "What are you talking about?" Helen pointed to the small jacaranda sapling. "It still has life. And over there," she pointed to a distant corner, "there's still a rose bush that can be saved. And that tree in the back just needs water and attention." To Augustus, this was incomprehensible. He saw only land that cost thousands of dollars a month in taxes and surveillance, waiting to be transformed into something productive. The old woman seemed to live in a parallel reality. "Madam," he said, trying to maintain his patience, "this garden is going to be demolished. Excavations begin in 3 weeks. You're wasting your time." Helen smiled, and in that smile there was a wisdom that made Augustus uncomfortable. "Time spent with love is never truly wasted, sir," she said, returning to tending the jacaranda sapling. Augustus left that day with a strange irritation in his chest. The image of the old woman remained etched in his mind in a way he couldn't explain. Over the next few days, every time he reviewed the plans for the new development, he remembered Helen's delicate hands caressing the leaves of the doomed plant. The issue became personal when Helen started appearing in the local newspaper. A young reporter, moved by her story, wrote a piece about the guardian of the lost garden. The article featured photos of Helen tending the surviving plants, recounted her story of dedication, and questioned the need to destroy the last green space in the neighborhood. The article had an unexpected impact. Social media mobilized, hashtags were created, and within days Helen became a symbol of resistance against what many called urban environmental destruction. Protesters began appearing at the garden gate with signs calling for the preservation of the space. For Augustus, this was a serious problem. His company depended on a solid image in the market, and being portrayed as an environmental villain could damage future business. Furthermore, the protests were delaying the construction schedule, which meant real financial losses. He decided to confront Helen directly. The next morning, he arrived at the garden alone, without the entourage of engineers and security. Helen was in the same place as always, tending the jacaranda sapling, which surprisingly seemed more vigorous than the first time he saw it. "We need to talk," he said, without preamble. Helen looked up with the same serenity as before. "Course, sir. Would you like some coffee? I brought it in a thermos." The simplicity of the invitation disarmed Augustus momentarily. He almost refused, but something in Helen's expression made him accept. She served the coffee in a plastic cup, and the two sat on the concrete bench near the dry fountain. "Why are you doing this?" Augustus asked, trying to maintain a professional tone. "Why are you causing all this commotion over a few dying plants?" Helen sipped her coffee slowly before answering. "Sir, how old are you?" 50. "But I don't see the relevance. I'm 72, she interrupted gently. "And for 40 years every day I came to this place. I knew every plant, every tree, every corner of this garden. I watched children grow up playing here. I saw couples meet among these flowers. I saw sad people find peace sitting on these benches." She paused, looking around with affection. "For you, this is just land. For me, it's the story of a lifetime. It's where I raised my children while I worked. It's where I found meaning when I thought there was nothing left for me in the world." Augustus felt a growing discomfort. He wasn't used to conversations that touched on emotional issues. His life was built on practical foundations: profit, growth, efficiency. "I understand it has sentimental value," he said, "but the reality is that the city needs housing. 300 families will be able to have a new home." "Wealthy families," Helen gently corrected. "I saw the prices of the apartments in the brochures. They're not for people like me, or like most of the people who live in this neighborhood." Augustus couldn't deny it. The development was indeed targeted at the upper class, but that was the logic of the market. Mrs. Helen, he said, using the name he had read in the article, I have a company to run, I have employees, suppliers, investors, I can't make decisions based solely on feelings, and I have a responsibility to life, she replied, pointing to the jacaranda sapling. This little plant doesn't have a voice to defend itself. The other plants that still resist don't either. Someone needs to speak for them. At that moment, Augustus noticed something that had gone unnoticed. The jacaranda sapling was indeed stronger. The leaves had a more intense green, and it was possible to see small new buds emerging among the branches. How is it growing in such dry soil? He asked, more to himself than to Helen. Love, she said simply. Water, conversation and love. It works with plants, and with people. In the days that followed, that conversation echoed in Augustus's mind in a disturbing way. He found himself thinking about Helen at the most unexpected moments, during executive meetings, reviewing contracts, even at home with his family. The situation became complicated when his own daughter, Marina, 23, recently graduated in biology, saw the report about Helen on television. During Sunday dinner, she brought up the subject. Dad, I saw a story about that woman who's taking care of an abandoned garden. It's our company's land, isn't it? Augustus nearly choked on his wine. Yes, it's one of the projects. How sad, Marina said, stirring her salad. 40 years taking care of the same place, and now she's going to lose everything. Marina, Augustus's wife Clarissa, intervened. Your father works in the construction industry. That's how the real estate market works. But Marina wouldn't be discouraged. Dad, don't you think the city has enough buildings already? When was the last time you really noticed a tree, a flower, a garden? The question hit Augustus like a punch to the stomach. When was the last time indeed? He lived among offices, cars with tinted windows, and luxury apartments. His reality was made of concrete, steel, and glass. Green was only the color of money in his spreadsheets. That night, he had trouble sleeping. He got up, went to the balcony of his 25th floor apartment, and looked out at the illuminated city below. Skyscrapers everywhere, many of them built by his company. But where were the trees? Where were the gardens? The following morning, he made a decision that surprised even himself. He would return to the garden, but not to resolve the issue with Helen. He would go to try and understand what she saw in that place. He arrived very early, before Helen even showed up. He walked alone through the land, observing details he had ignored on previous visits. The garden was truly devastated, but there were signs of life he hadn't noticed. Small leaves sprouting on branches that seemed dead, wild flowers growing between cracks in the concrete, and the jacaranda sapling, visibly stronger than the previous week. He sat on the bench, where he had spoken with Helen, and tried to imagine what the place must have been like in its glory days. He closed his eyes and could almost hear children's laughter, the conversations of couples in love, the sound of the fountains running water. That's when Helen arrived, carrying her small toolbox and a plastic bottle of water. "Good morning, Mr. Augustus," she said, showing no surprise at finding him there. "Good morning, Mrs. Helen. I'm sorry to be here so early. No need to apologize. The garden belongs to everyone who loves it." Helen began her morning routine, watering the surviving plants, weeding, talking affectionately to each one as if they were loved ones. Augustus watched in silence, fascinated by the dedication and tenderness of this woman. "Can I help?" he asked, surprising himself. Helen smiled. "Of course. Grab that bottle over there and help me water the saplings at the back." For an hour, Augustus Magnus, a millionaire accustomed to commanding hundreds of employees, watered plants under the guidance of a retired, elderly gardener. His hands, accustomed only to papers and pens, got dirty with soil for the first time in decades. "Why do you keep doing this?" he asked, as they tended to a small rose bush that stubbornly persisted. Helen stopped what she was doing and looked into his eyes. "Mr. Augustus, may I ask you a personal question?" He nodded. "Are you happy?" The question caught him completely off guard. Happy? He had success, money, professional recognition, but happy? "I have everything a man could want," he replied evasively. "That's not what I asked." Augustus was silent for a long time. The truth was, it had been years since he'd asked himself that question. His life was a succession of achieved goals, profits made, projects completed, but there was an emptiness he preferred not to examine too closely. "I don't know," he finally admitted. "It's been a long time since I thought about it." Helen nodded understandingly. "I went through a period like that too. After my husband died, I thought life was over. I had 2 young children, little money, no prospects. That's when I started working here." She caressed the leaves of the rose bush with infinite tenderness. "The plants taught me that life always finds a way to continue, even in the most difficult conditions. They gave me purpose when I thought there was no reason to exist anymore." "And now?" Augustus asked. "Now I know my purpose was to take care of life. Not just plants, but everything that represents hope and beauty in the world." For the rest of that morning, they worked side by side in silence. Augustus discovered that there was something deeply relaxing about tending to the plants. It was as if time passed differently, slower, more meaningfully. When Helen prepared to leave, he made an unexpected request. "Can I come back tomorrow? To help, I mean." She smiled. "You'll be very welcome." Over the following weeks, a strange routine was established. Augustus arrived early at the garden, before going to the office, and spent an hour tending to the plants with Helen. His secretaries found his new schedule unusual, but he offered no explanations. Gradually, the garden began to show signs of recovery. The jacaranda sapling was visibly stronger, the rose bush had produced 2 flowers, and several other plants that seemed dead began to sprout new branches. "It's incredible," Augustus said one morning, observing a small petunia that had bloomed overnight. "How is this possible?" "Plants are more resilient than we imagine," Helen explained. "They may appear dead on the outside, but as long as the roots are alive, there's always hope." The phrase echoed in Augustus's mind. Living roots, hope, concepts he had forgotten a long time ago. That's when something happened that would change everything. Marina, his daughter, decided to visit him at the office one Friday afternoon. She arrived early, and not finding him, asked his secretary where he was. The answer intrigued her. "Your father is in the garden, as he is every morning." Curious, Marina went to the location and found a scene she never would have imagined. Her father, the always impeccable businessman, was kneeling in the dirt, watering plants, alongside an elderly woman. Both were chatting animatedly about gardening techniques. "Dad," she said, approaching cautiously. Augustus stood up, slightly embarrassed. His clothes were dirty with soil, his nails dark with earth. "Marina, what are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same thing," she replied, but there was a smile on her face. "Dad, is this the garden from the news report?" Helen approached. "You must be Mr. Augustus's daughter. He talks about you a lot." Marina looked around, impressed. The garden was still far from its past glory, but it was possible to see life in various corners. Flowers were blooming, green leaves were sprouting, and there was a sense of hope in the air. "Dad, I didn't know you liked gardening." "I didn't either," he admitted. "Mrs. Helen has been teaching me many things." That afternoon, the 3 of them worked together in the garden. Marina, with her knowledge of biology, identified several species that could be recovered. Helen shared decades of practical experience, and Augustus discovered that the greatest joy he had felt in years came from seeing a small seed sprout under his care. That night, during family dinner, Augustus made an announcement that shocked his wife and daughter. "I'm thinking of canceling the housing development project." Clarissa nearly spilled her wine. "Augustus, have you lost your mind? This is millions of dollars in investment, and millions in profit," Marina added, but there was hope in her voice. "Perhaps there are things more important than profit," he said, surprising himself with his own words. In the following days, Augustus immersed himself in research on urban environmental preservation, green space revitalization projects, and ways to reconcile real estate development with conservation. He discovered that there were tax incentives for companies investing in environmental projects, and that urban gardens were becoming valuable competitive differentiators. But more important than the economic issues was what was happening to him. The mornings in the garden with Helen had become the most significant part of his days. There, away from the pressures of the office, he rediscovered aspects of himself he had forgotten: the ability to marvel at small miracles, the satisfaction of caring for something fragile and watching it grow, the peace that came from working with his hands. "Helen," he said one morning, as they planted new seedlings he had bought from a nursery, "I need to tell you something." She stopped what she was doing and looked at him attentively. "I've decided not to build the housing complex." Helen's face lit up, but she didn't show excessive surprise, as if she somehow already knew. "And what do you plan to do with the land?" "I want to return it to the city, but not as it was before. I want to create something special. A public garden that will serve as a model for other similar projects." Helen smiled, and in that smile there was a pure joy that deeply touched Augustus's heart. "Mr. Augustus," she said, "I think you've finally found your true calling." The garden revitalization project became the most challenging and rewarding of Augustus's career. For the first time, he was building something to last not just decades, but generations. He hired the best landscape architects, but kept Helen as the principal consultant, recognizing that her practical knowledge was irreplaceable. Marina left a job at a multinational corporation to coordinate the environmental aspects of the project. Together, father and daughter developed a space that combined the classic beauty of the old garden with modern sustainable technologies. The revitalized garden was inaugurated 6 months later, in a moving ceremony that brought together hundreds of people from the community. Helen cut the ribbon wearing the same simple dress she wore to work, but with a radiant smile that illuminated her entire face. "This is a day I never thought I'd live to see," she said, into the microphone, her voice choked with emotion. "For 2 years, I took care of these plants alone, not knowing if anyone would understand that preserving life is worth more than any profit. Today I see that faith pays off." Augustus took the microphone next. He looked at the crowd, then at Helen, then at his daughter Marina, who smiled proudly beside him. "For 58 years, I believed that success was measured by the amount of concrete we could stack vertically," he said. "A wise woman taught me that true success is measured by the amount of life we cultivate around us." And it was at that moment, as the first tears of emotion streamed down the millionaire's face, that a small seed, planted decades ago by a long-forgotten gardener, finally found the strength to sprout. The earth, moistened by the sincere tears of repentance and gratitude, offered the last ingredient the seed needed: the certainty that it would be loved. Helen noticed the tiny green sprout emerging from between her feet and smiled, knowing that miracles always arrive when we least expect them, but exactly when we need them most. The garden was complete again, not only in plants and flowers, but in transformed hearts and lives redirected to what truly matters. Years later, the Helen Augustus Garden, as it became officially known, became a model for similar projects across the country. Augustus transformed his construction company into a firm specializing in sustainable architecture, and Marina developed a non-governmental organization dedicated to the preservation of urban green spaces. But perhaps the greatest legacy of that garden was the lesson an old gardener taught a hardened millionaire, that true wealth lies not in what we accumulate, but in what we cultivate, not in what we build for ourselves, but in what we preserve for future generations. Helen continued to care for the garden until she turned 80, when she finally allowed other gardeners to take over her duties. But she never stopped visiting it daily, always carrying her small toolbox, talking to the plants like old friends, and reminding everyone who crossed her path that time spent with love is never truly lost. And when people asked how she managed to transform the heart of one of the city's most hardened businessmen, Helen would just smile and point to the small jacaranda sapling, now a leafy tree that shaded half the garden, saying, "I didn't transform anyone. I just planted seeds of hope and waited for life to do the rest." Sometimes, all someone needs is some good earth and a lot of love to finally discover who they truly are.